Picture this. A young lion cub, traumatized and lost, stumbles through the desert until he collapses from exhaustion. Two unlikely creatures find him and, instead of offering complex therapy or deep philosophical counsel, they teach him a simple Swahili phrase, Hakuna Matata. What follows is one of the most memorable musical sequences in Disney history, complete with dancing, singing, and the promise that these three words can solve all of life's problems. For decades, audiences have accepted this scene at face value. Hakuna Matata means no worries, and Timon and Pumbaa are teaching Simba to live carefree, to forget his troubles and embrace a life of simple pleasures. It's become a cultural phenomenon, printed on t-shirts, quoted in graduation speeches, and used as the ultimate expression of letting go of stress and anxiety. But what if we've been fundamentally misunderstanding this scene? What if Hakuna Matata isn't about being carefree at all, but about something far more sophisticated and, frankly, more disturbing? Look closer at that iconic moment when Timon and Pumbaa first encounter Simba. They don't stumble upon a playful cub having an adventure. They find what appears to be a young lion on the verge of perishing in the wilderness. Their response isn't the bumbling confusion you'd expect from simple comic relief characters. Instead, they demonstrate immediate, practiced competence in crisis intervention. They know exactly how to revive him, exactly what to feed him. And most importantly, they have a ready-made philosophical framework designed specifically for someone in psychological distress. This isn't the behavior of carefree wanderers who happen to develop a catchy slogan. This is the behavior of individuals who have extensive experience dealing with trauma, exile, and psychological breakdown. They recognize Simba's condition instantly because they've been there themselves. Consider the visual storytelling in their introduction. When we first see Timon and Pumbaa, they're not lounging carelessly in paradise. They're foraging, constantly alert, moving with the practiced efficiency of creatures who have learned to thrive in an environment that doesn't naturally welcome them. The jungle they inhabit isn't presented as some magical wonderland where food falls from trees. It's a place where you have to know which grubs are edible, where to find fresh water, and how to avoid the predators that could easily eliminate a meerkat and warthog. Their home base, when we finally see it, tells an even more revealing story. This isn't a simple shelter thrown together by creatures living in the moment. It's a sophisticated setup with multiple levels, strategic vantage points, and clear evidence of long-term planning. These are the accommodations of individuals who have spent considerable time perfecting a lifestyle completely independent of traditional society. The most telling detail, however, is how quickly and expertly they transition from finding a near-lifeless cub to implementing what can only be described as a comprehensive rehabilitation program. They don't just feed Simba and send him on his way. They immediately begin a systematic process of psychological restructuring, using their philosophy as the foundation for rebuilding his entire worldview. This suggests that Hakuna Matata isn't a casual motto they picked up along the way. It's a refined, tested methodology that they've developed and presumably used before. The question becomes, developed for what purpose and refined through what experiences? The answer becomes clearer when you examine the specific elements of their teaching approach. They don't simply tell Simba to forget his worries. They provide him with alternative frameworks for understanding identity, purpose, and belonging. They give him new social structures, new definitions of family, and most critically, new ways of finding meaning that don't depend on external validation or traditional hierarchies. This is not the curriculum of simple-minded creatures teaching carelessness. This is the curriculum of sophisticated survivors teaching other exiles how to build meaningful lives outside the structures that rejected them. The implications are staggering. If Hakuna Matata is actually a carefully developed philosophy created by and for exiles, then millions of people have been unconsciously learning and adopting what is essentially a survival guide for social outcasts. Disney, perhaps without realizing it, has been teaching audiences how to thrive after being rejected by traditional society. But to understand the true depth of this philosophy, we need to look at who created it, and more importantly, what experiences drove them to develop such a sophisticated system for dealing with exile and social rejection. To understand the true nature of Hakuna Matata, we must examine its creators. And here's where the story becomes considerably darker than Disney's surface narrative suggests. Timon's backstory, revealed in The Lion King 1:1-2, provides crucial insight into the psychology behind the philosophy. He wasn't born into the carefree lifestyle we see in the original film. He was a member of a highly structured meerkat society with strict rules, designated roles, and clear expectations for every individual. More importantly, he was a failure within that system. The film shows us Timon repeatedly attempting to fulfill his assigned role as a tunnel digger, only to cause disasters that endanger his entire community. But look beyond the comedic presentation and you'll see something much more troubling. A systematic campaign of social rejection that ultimately drives him into exile. His fellow meerkats don't just dismiss his failures, they actively ostracize him, making it clear that he will never belong in their society. This isn't gentle encouragement to find his own path. This is social banishment disguised as comedy. By the time Timon leaves his colony, he's been thoroughly convinced that he's fundamentally broken, unable to contribute to any community, and destined to live as an outsider. Pumbaa's exile follows a similar pattern, though Disney works even harder to mask the trauma with humor. His gas problem becomes a running gag throughout the franchise, but consider what this represents in practical terms. He's been rejected by his own species due to a physical condition he cannot control. Every social interaction becomes a source of shame and eventual rejection. The implications are devastating when you strip away the comedic framing. Pumbaa has learned that his very presence is unwelcome in social situations, that his natural bodily functions make him unsuitable for community life, and that he must either live in isolation or find others who can tolerate what mainstream society finds repulsive. This pattern, using humor to mask deep psychological trauma, appears throughout Disney's catalog, but rarely as systematically as with these two characters. Their comedic traits aren't just personality quirks. They're the specific reasons they were banished from their respective societies. What makes their situation particularly complex is the evidence that both characters possess sophisticated understanding of social structures, survival tactics, and community dynamics. Timon demonstrates detailed knowledge of meerkat social hierarchies, territorial boundaries, and collective survival strategies. Pumbaa shows familiarity with warthog social behavior, foraging techniques, and predator avoidance systems. These aren't simple creatures who never learned civilized behavior. These are former members of complex societies who have been forced to develop alternative survival strategies. Their expertise in living outside traditional structures isn't accidental. It's the result of extensive, painful experience in being rejected by those structures. The moment they encounter each other becomes crucial to understanding their philosophy's development. This isn't a casual meeting between two happy-go-lucky wanderers. This is the collision of two traumatized exiles who recognize something familiar in each other's situation. Watch their first interaction carefully. There's immediate recognition, not just of each other's loneliness, but of each other's specific type of social damage. They don't need lengthy explanations of their circumstances. They instinctively understand that they're both refugees from societies that found them fundamentally unacceptable. Their decision to form a partnership isn't based on simple friendship or shared interests. It's a mutual survival pact between two individuals who have learned that traditional social structures will inevitably reject them. They're creating an alternative family unit because they've been denied access to conventional ones. This context transforms our understanding of how Hakuna Matata developed. It wasn't created as a general life philosophy for happy creatures living carefree lives. It was developed as mutual therapy between two traumatized exiles who needed to find ways to cope with social rejection, build self-worth outside traditional validation systems, and create meaning in lives that mainstream society had deemed worthless. The sophistication of their philosophical framework becomes even more remarkable when viewed through this lens. They haven't just learned to survive outside society, they've created a comprehensive alternative value system that allows them to thrive. They've transformed their greatest sources of shame, Timon's incompetence at traditional meerkat roles, Pumbaa's social awkwardness, into sources of strength and identity. More impressively, they've developed a system that's transferable to other exiles. When they encounter Simba, they don't just offer comfort. They offer a complete rehabilitation program based on their own successful recovery from social rejection. Their individual exiles created the perfect conditions for a revolutionary philosophy. Timon's experience with systematic failure taught him how to rebuild self-worth from scratch. Pumbaa's experience with physical shame taught him how to redefine social acceptance. Together, they developed a framework that addresses the core psychological challenges faced by anyone who has been rejected by their original community. This raises profound questions about the nature of their philosophy and its implications for the broader narrative. If Hakuna Matata is fundamentally a system developed by and for social outcasts, what does it mean that it proves so effective not just for other exiles but for mainstream audiences? Are we unconsciously responding to exile wisdom because our own society creates more outcasts than we care to acknowledge? Now that we understand the traumatic origins of Hakuna Matata, we can begin to analyze its true structure. What emerges is not a simple feel-good motto, but a sophisticated three-pillar system designed specifically to help exiles rebuild their psychological foundations after social rejection. The linguistic analysis alone reveals layers of complexity that most audiences miss entirely. Hakuna Matata translates literally as, "there are no troubles." But the way Timon and Pumbaa teach it to Simba demonstrates that they're not promoting ignorance of problems. Instead, they're teaching active recontextualization of difficulties. Watch the sequence again. They don't tell Simba to pretend his problems don't exist. They teach him to evaluate those problems through a completely different framework. When Simba expresses guilt about his past, they don't dismiss his feelings. Instead, they demonstrate how to examine those feelings from a perspective that doesn't rely on external judgment or societal expectations. This is the first pillar of their philosophy: strategic detachment. They're teaching Simba to emotionally disconnect from the approval systems that caused his trauma in the first place. This isn't numbness or avoidance. It's a conscious choice to stop deriving self-worth from sources that have proven unreliable or hostile. Consider how they demonstrate this principle. When they explain their lifestyle to Simba, they don't present it as superior to Pride Rock culture. They present it as completely independent from Pride Rock culture. They've created evaluation criteria that exist entirely outside the value systems that rejected them. Timon doesn't prove his worth by becoming better at digging tunnels. He creates a lifestyle where tunnel digging skills are irrelevant. Pumbaa doesn't overcome his social awkwardness. He builds relationships where that awkwardness becomes endearing rather than shameful. They've achieved detachment not through emotional numbing, but through systematic reconstruction of their reference points. The second pillar, redefinition, represents perhaps their most sophisticated psychological innovation. They don't just abandon the things that brought them shame. They transform those very things into sources of strength and identity. The grub-eating sequence isn't just about survival nutrition. It's a masterclass in symbolic transformation. They take something that mainstream society considers disgusting and reframe it as gourmet cuisine. But more importantly, they make this reframing infectious. By the end of the sequence, Simba isn't just tolerating their food choices, he's enthusiastically embracing them. This demonstrates their understanding of a crucial psychological principle. Shame loses its power when you control the narrative around it. Instead of hiding their unconventional choices, they celebrate them. Instead of apologizing for their differences, they present those differences as advantages. Watch how they apply this to Simba's situation. They don't tell him to forget about being a lion or abandon his royal heritage. Instead, they show him how to be a different kind of lion, one whose worth isn't determined by pride politics or traditional hierarchies. They're teaching him to redefine strength, leadership, and even identity itself. The third pillar, community creation, reveals the most profound aspect of their system. They don't just survive as isolated individuals, they actively build chosen families that replace the biological and social connections they've lost. Their relationship with each other demonstrates this principle in action. They haven't just become friends. They've created a family structure that provides all the emotional support, security, and belonging that their original communities failed to offer. More importantly, this family operates on entirely different principles than traditional social groups. Their community doesn't have hierarchies based on strength, intelligence, or social status. It doesn't require members to fulfill predetermined roles or meet external expectations. Instead, it operates on mutual acceptance, shared values, and chosen loyalty. This isn't accident. It's intentional design based on their understanding of what caused their original social failures. When they integrate Simba into this community, they demonstrate the system's expandability. They don't just add him to their existing structure. They evolve their family unit to accommodate his specific needs and trauma. This flexibility represents sophisticated understanding of how different types of exile require different approaches to recovery. The psychological sophistication becomes even more apparent when compared to real-world therapeutic approaches. Their system incorporates elements of cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, and community-based healing models. They're essentially practicing group therapy disguised as casual friendship. Their approach addresses the three primary psychological challenges faced by social exiles: damaged self-worth, distorted identity concepts, and social isolation. The strategic detachment addresses the self-worth issues by removing external validation from the equation. The redefinition process rebuilds identity around chosen values rather than imposed expectations. The community creation resolves isolation by providing reliable, unconditional social connections. Most remarkably, their system includes built-in protection against the depression and self-destruction that typically follows social rejection. By creating meaning that doesn't depend on external approval, they've immunized themselves against the psychological devastation that destroys many exiles. This explains why their philosophy works so effectively for Simba, despite his very different circumstances. While his exile is self-imposed rather than socially enforced, he faces the same core challenges: damaged self-worth from perceived failure, distorted identity concepts based on external expectations, and isolation from his natural community. Their rehabilitation program addresses his specific trauma while teaching him broader principles for psychological resilience. They don't just help him recover from his current crisis, they equip him with tools for handling future challenges without relying on traditional support systems. The implications are staggering. These two supposed comic relief characters have essentially developed and successfully implemented a comprehensive treatment program for social rejection trauma. They've created a sustainable alternative society that not only supports its members, but actively strengthens them against future rejection. But the most remarkable thing about this philosophy is how it spreads beyond their small community, influencing not just individual recovery, but challenging the entire social structure that created the need for exile in the first place. The true test of any philosophy lies not in its ability to comfort its creators, but in its capacity to transform others. When we examine Simba's journey under the influence of Hakuna Matata, we discover something remarkable. This exile wisdom doesn't just provide temporary relief from trauma, it fundamentally rewires how individuals relate to power, identity, and social responsibility. Simba's transformation reveals the philosophy's most sophisticated aspect. Timon and Pumbaa don't simply help him forget his past, they teach him to process that past through an entirely different psychological framework. Watch the progression carefully. When Simba first arrives, he's consumed by guilt over his perceived role in Mufasa's demise. Traditional therapeutic approaches might focus on helping him understand that he wasn't responsible, or on processing his grief through accepted emotional stages. Instead, Timon and Pumbaa do something far more radical. They teach him to question the entire value system that makes his guilt meaningful in the first place. They don't argue that he wasn't responsible for the tragedy. They demonstrate that responsibility itself can be understood in completely different ways depending on your philosophical framework. This represents a crucial insight about how exile wisdom operates. It doesn't erase pain or trauma. It provides alternative context for understanding that pain. Simba never stops caring about his father or forgetting the tragedy at Pride Rock. Instead, he learns to hold those experiences within a worldview that doesn't define his entire identity around that single traumatic event. The jungle setting becomes crucial to understanding this process. It's not just a backdrop for their adventures, it's a physical metaphor for alternative society. Here, traditional pride hierarchies don't exist. Strength isn't measured by the ability to dominate other lions. Leadership isn't inherited through bloodline. Survival depends on cooperation, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of natural systems rather than political maneuvering. More importantly, the jungle operates on principles that directly contradict Pride Rock's social structure. In this environment, Timon's unconventional problem-solving abilities become assets rather than liabilities. Pumbaa's gentle nature and encyclopedic knowledge of edible insects make him a valuable community member, rather than a social embarrassment. They've found an environment where their supposed weaknesses become strengths. This pattern of finding spaces where exile characteristics become advantages appears throughout Disney's catalog, though rarely as systematically explored. Consider how many Disney protagonists achieve their greatest successes only after being rejected by their original communities. Hercules becomes a true hero only after leaving Mount Olympus. Mulan finds her authentic strength after being expelled from traditional feminine roles. Even Elsa discovers her full potential only after fleeing the social constraints of Arendelle. The recurring theme of found family in Disney narratives represents a direct extension of exile wisdom. These alternative family structures consistently operate on principles that contradict traditional social hierarchies. They prioritize chosen loyalty over blood relations, shared values over inherited status, and mutual support over competitive advancement. What makes the Hakuna Matata philosophy particularly sophisticated is how it prepares its adherents to eventually re-engage with mainstream society from a position of strength rather than desperation. When Simba finally returns to Pride Rock, he doesn't come back as a reformed exile begging for acceptance. He returns as an individual who has developed alternative sources of strength and identity that make him immune to the manipulation and control tactics that previously defined pride politics. This creates a fascinating paradox in the film's resolution. Simba defeats Scar not by becoming a better traditional lion, but by applying lessons learned from living completely outside traditional lion society. His fighting style, leadership approach, and problem-solving methods all reflect the influence of exile wisdom rather than royal training. Even more subversively, his eventual leadership of Pride Rock incorporates principles learned from Timon and Pumbaa's alternative community. The Pride Lands under Simba's rule appear more inclusive, less hierarchical, and more focused on collective well-being than traditional pride structures. He's essentially implemented exile wisdom at the societal level. This transformation pattern suggests something profound about the relationship between exile and social change. Those who have been forced to develop alternative survival strategies often return to mainstream society with innovations that benefit everyone, not just other outcasts. They've been forced to think outside existing systems, giving them unique perspectives on those systems' limitations and potential improvements. The infectious nature of this wisdom becomes apparent when we consider how readily mainstream audiences embrace Hakuna Matata without fully understanding its origins or implications. Millions of people have adopted this philosophy as a stress relief technique, unaware that they're practicing a methodology specifically developed for surviving social rejection and rebuilding identity outside traditional validation systems. This raises uncomfortable questions about why exile wisdom resonates so strongly with mainstream audiences. Perhaps it suggests that traditional social structures create more psychological casualties than we acknowledge. Perhaps the appeal of Hakuna Matata reflects widespread dissatisfaction with conventional approaches to identity, success, and belonging. The philosophy's popularity might indicate that even individuals who haven't experienced formal exile recognize the limitations of deriving self-worth from external validation, hierarchical advancement, and social conformity. They're unconsciously drawn to alternative frameworks that promise more sustainable approaches to psychological well-being. This phenomenon becomes even more intriguing when we consider that Disney, presumably without conscious intention, has been teaching exile wisdom to multiple generations of children. Young audiences learn these principles before they've fully internalized traditional social expectations, potentially immunizing them against some of the psychological damage that creates the need for exile in the first place. The subversive implications are staggering. A major entertainment corporation has been systematically teaching audiences to question social hierarchies, develop alternative identity frameworks, and create chosen families that operate outside traditional structures. They've been promoting psychological independence from external validation systems and demonstrating that society's rejects often possess wisdom that benefits everyone. This brings us to the most unsettling truth about Hakuna Matata and its broader implications for how we understand social structures, individual psychology, and the relationship between exile and wisdom. Here's the truth that Disney accidentally embedded in their seemingly innocent children's film. Hakuna Matata isn't an escape from society's problems. It's a devastating critique of society itself. When we strip away the colorful animation and catchy music, what emerges is a philosophy that systematically exposes the arbitrary and often destructive nature of social hierarchies, cultural expectations, and traditional validation systems. Timon and Pumbaa haven't just learned to survive outside mainstream society. They've discovered that life outside those structures can be healthier, more sustainable, and more fulfilling than life within them. This realization becomes deeply uncomfortable when we examine the evidence. Throughout the film, the characters operating within traditional social structures consistently demonstrate higher levels of stress, anxiety, and destructive behavior than those living according to exile wisdom. Pride Rock operates on principles of inherited power, territorial aggression, and rigid social roles that create constant conflict and instability. Meanwhile, the jungle community thrives on cooperation, mutual support, and flexible problem solving. They've eliminated the competitive hierarchies that generate most social stress. They've created sustainable systems that don't require anyone to fail for others to succeed. Most remarkably, they've developed approaches to conflict resolution that don't depend on domination or submission. The implications are staggering. The film accidentally argues that society's rejects might actually be happier, healthier, and more psychologically resilient than those who successfully conform to mainstream expectations. It suggests that the characteristics that lead to social rejection, unconventional thinking, inability to fulfill prescribed roles, resistance to hierarchical structures, might actually be indicators of psychological health rather than dysfunction. This interpretation gains credibility when we examine why Hakuna Matata resonates so powerfully in contemporary culture. We're living through an era of unprecedented social fragmentation, where traditional structures of belonging, extended families, stable communities, lifelong careers, religious institutions, have weakened or disappeared entirely. Millions of people experience various forms of modern exile, economic displacement that forces them away from their communities, social media dynamics that create new forms of rejection and ostracism, cultural changes that make traditional life paths inaccessible or meaningless, and technological disruption that eliminates entire categories of social identity. The contemporary relevance becomes striking when we consider how many modern problems mirror the challenges that Timon and Pumbaa's philosophy addresses. Social media creates validation systems that are even more arbitrary and psychologically destructive than traditional hierarchies. Economic inequality generates forms of social rejection based on circumstances largely beyond individual control. Cultural polarization forces people to choose between authentic self-expression and social acceptance. Hakuna Matata offers a framework for navigating these challenges that traditional self-help approaches often miss. Instead of trying to help people succeed within dysfunctional systems, it teaches them to evaluate those systems critically and develop alternative sources of meaning and belonging. The philosophy's emphasis on chosen family becomes particularly relevant in an era where biological families are increasingly scattered and traditional communities have weakened. Its focus on redefining success outside conventional metrics speaks to generations facing economic instability and career uncertainty. Its techniques for building self-worth independent of external validation address psychological challenges that social media has made ubiquitous. Perhaps most significantly, its demonstration that supposedly failed individuals can create thriving alternative communities offers hope to anyone who has experienced rejection from mainstream society. It suggests that being unable to conform to traditional expectations might not be a personal failure, but a sign that those expectations themselves are problematic. This reading of the film reveals something accidentally radical about Disney's message. While presumably intending to create a feel-good story about overcoming adversity, they've actually produced a systematic critique of social hierarchies and a blueprint for creating alternative communities based on mutual support rather than competitive advancement. The corporation that built its empire on promoting traditional family values has inadvertently taught millions of children to question authority, resist social pressure, and create chosen families that operate outside conventional structures. They've popularized a philosophy that suggests society's rejects might possess wisdom that could benefit everyone. The lasting impact cannot be overstated. Multiple generations have internalized these principles during their formative years, potentially explaining some of the social changes we've witnessed over the past several decades. The rise of chosen family concepts, the questioning of traditional career paths, the emphasis on mental health and authentic self-expression, and the creation of alternative communities around shared interests rather than geographic proximity all reflect the influence of exile wisdom. We've been teaching children that it's possible to create meaningful, sustainable lives outside traditional social structures. We've been demonstrating that individuals rejected by mainstream society often develop innovations that benefit everyone. We've been promoting psychological independence from external validation systems and suggesting that conformity might be more problematic than nonconformity. The uncomfortable question becomes, What does this say about our society that exile wisdom resonates so strongly with mainstream audiences? Why are so many people drawn to a philosophy specifically developed for social outcasts? What does it mean that children's entertainment has been more effective at addressing modern psychological challenges than traditional institutions? Perhaps the answer is that our social structures have become so dysfunctional that even those who successfully navigate them recognize their limitations. Perhaps the appeal of Hakuna Matata reflects a widespread understanding that traditional approaches to success, belonging, and self-worth are failing to provide the psychological satisfaction they promise. This interpretation transforms our understanding of The Lion King from a simple story about a prince reclaiming his throne into something far more subversive, a demonstration that the most profound wisdom often comes from those who have been forced to think outside existing systems, and that sometimes the healthiest response to a sick society is to create alternative ways of living entirely. The next time you hear someone casually reference Hakuna Matata, remember that they're unconsciously invoking a sophisticated philosophy developed by exiles, refined through trauma, and designed to help social outcasts build meaningful lives outside traditional structures. They're participating in an accidental revolution that questions the very foundations of how we organize society and define individual worth. The real question isn't whether this philosophy works. The evidence suggests it does. The question is what it means that we needed it in the first place, and what that tells us about the society that created the conditions requiring such wisdom to develop.